Hello folks, and welcome back to another episode of Marvelous Videos. In this episode, we thought of sifting through the folds of time and curating a selection comprising 10 Arthouse body horror films that have earned the admiration of critics and theatergoers alike. But before we go into our discussion, what really is Arthouse horror? Where does it take root? What sets it apart from other genres of horror? To put it simply, body horror is a subgenre that brings into focus grotesque, often unnatural violation or transformation of the human or non-human entities. While body horror as a cinematic genre emerged as late as the early 70s, to retrace its origins, we need to travel as far back as the incidents of Gothic fiction through the ages to understand the trajectory of its history. However, for today's episode, we'll just stick to its arrival as a legacy that we fans have delighted and sought refuge in as a respite from textbook horror, which can sometimes get overbearing. That's not to say I bear any ill will or spite for conventional horror films. Body horror has always been relatively niche. It focuses more on the intangible horrors that plague us, horrors that are seldom comprehensible. Body horror is a genre that stirs us out of apathy, of familiar rhetorics of salvation and redemption, into a limbo, a pit of perpetual chaos. It's a space of artistic subversion where the dark recesses of our minds are stripped bare, often without qualms, to explore a grittier, more visceral truth of existence that we would rather tuck away into the abyss of myths and fables. These 10 films that we've chosen challenge our notions of normal by weaving horrors that question and blur the preconceived notions of perceived natural and unnatural. Alright, let's dive into our list. But before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Audition, 1999. So first up on our list, we've got the Japanese classic released in 1999, Audition, directed by Takashi Miike. Based on a novel bearing the same name by Ryu Murakami, the film is a grim tale of the nauseating and tormenting conditions that individuals are made to live through, which leave a searing imprint on the mind and soul to profoundly unsettling measure, often urging us to arrive at the questions, did we get it right? After years of evolution, what have we emerged to be? What does it mean to be human? Miike's Audition is a rare gem that stands tall even to this day, amidst the clutter of vain shock value flicks. It's rich in plot as it is in delivering moments that incite a cathartic release of horror and pain that much of the third act builds on. The story begins with a widower named Shigeharu Aoyama, who shares an excellent camaraderie with his son. It's only when his son counsels Aoyama to look for a partner upon realizing his estrangement from losing his wife that he sets out to look for a partner. Aoyama devises an elaborate charade with a friend to audition a host of women with the pretext of signing them in for a film, which was, needless to say, nothing but a phony ploy to meet a potential bride. Among all the women, there appears a nimble and somewhat frail girl named Asami, who's in her early 20s. Her demeanor is strikingly morbid, with a hint of neglect and apathy. Nonetheless, she catches the attention of Aoyama, who, as we see, is absolutely smitten with her love, and the two eventually meet and consummate their date. However, things soon begin to take a turn for the worse after Aoyama hits the floor within seconds after a few sips of his favorite brand of liquor. Aoyama then has a series of hallucinatory visions thereafter that reveal Asami's horrifying pathology and the traumatizing events in her life that wrecked her psyche. As Aoyama regains consciousness, we see Asami inject a paralytic agent into his tongue that renders him inert and immobile but conscious and alert. Ayami then savors the moment by mounting him and piercing his body with needles while uttering the phrase, "deeper and deeper." She then pulls out a wire which she wraps around his leg and tears it off to hurl it across the window. The movie is slow burn and takes its time for the crowning moment, and once it does reach its penultimate moment of dissolution and truth, it's a masterclass in mayhem and anarchy. What's particularly fascinating here in this film is the trope of recurring dreams and visions, which often compel us to ponder over the projections as a nightmare that Aoyama keeps waking in and out out of. Regardless, the film is an excellent study of how misogynistic and cruel we are as a society, where Asami is birthed out of our guilt-ridden conscience as a necessary evil, as a monster, spawned from neglect, abuse, and torture to purge us of the deceptions and lies that we spew to ensnare innocence for our amusement.
And you will discover the substance of a report and deliver it directly to me.
Naked Lunch, 1991. Next up, we have a film that, for lack of a better word, is a bit difficult to categorize. However, there is a word for that too: surrealist fiction, which is what this film is all about. Naked Lunch is a surrealist horror drama based on the life and works of William S. Burroughs, one of the triumvirate icons of the Beat generation. The film was written and directed by David Cronenberg, who does a fine job of weaving a narrative that's designed to fall out of place and spill out of proportion. As a matter of fact, Cronenberg was held in high regard by Burroughs, who believed that if there was anyone who had what it takes to make the film, it had to be Cronenberg. Naked Lunch is one of those films that pays no heed to structure, plot, or setting. So what exactly does the film offer? Well, for starters, stunning visuals that are at once graphic, venomous, and ludicrous, but never once dull or lukewarm. Essentially, Cronenberg's Naked Lunch is a psychedelic odyssey of an exterminator turned writer who is so strung out of his mind that he dabbles in a world of typewriters and protoplasmic beasts that are often the same in a place called the Interzone, somewhere in North Africa. The setting is strongly reminiscent of Burroughs' own experiences from his days at the Tangier International Zone in North Africa. The film, albeit deceptively incoherent, is a poignant allegory that offers valuable insights into the grim realities of authorial pursuits. Writing as a means to reclaim agency and redemption has often led many individuals into the dark alleys of desolation, chaos that few have crawled out of unscathed. The dangers of psychedelics as a recreational activity to liberate the mind can often distort our perception of what's real, as it did with our protagonist, William Lee, who shoots his romantic interest twice in the film in a game where he impersonates William Tell. The Substance, 2024. Any body horror, the very idea of it, begins to take a course from a space of hyperfixation, a maddening obsession as a means to reinforce and claim agency, an audience with which to engage without fear or judgment. In that sense, the horror that unfolds before our eyes is essentially the angst or anxiety of rot, decay, loss, and impermanence. Coralie Farge's The Substance is a terrifying tale of our collective obsession with the ideal body, with beauty, a construct that dehumanizes us every step of the way, especially for those of us who make our way into the spotlight as actors or performers. The story follows the descent of an aerobics show host named Elizabeth, who also happens to be an Academy Award-winning actress. However, things go awry when she's fired from her job on her 50th birthday for being too old. Elizabeth suffers a crash while driving home from the studio and ends up in the hospital, where she learns about the substance from a male nurse. The substance is a serum that, once administered, will produce a younger version of the user without blemishes. However, since the clone and the user are intertwined in a state of perpetual symbiosis, one must live and thrive at the cost of the other. Every 7 days, they need to switch activation by injecting a stabilizer harvested from the older body to that of the younger form, while the inactive one lies unconscious. Elizabeth agrees to the process, and a younger, charming Sue emerges from a slit at her back. Sue then goes on to get hired by the producer to replace Elizabeth as the new host of her show. Sue celebrates her youth by indulging in parties and hookups, while Elizabeth succumbs to binge drinking and stress eating as a means to cope with her loss of youth and beauty. Eventually, Sue exhausts the supply of stabilizer to avoid the switch, which causes Elizabeth to age faster to the point where she becomes a frail old woman with a hunched back. Elizabeth obtains a serum to terminate Sue, but things go awry when she doesn't administer the total dose. Sue eventually regains consciousness and brutalizes Elizabeth to death. In the final act, we see Sue trying to recreate another version of herself. Due to the absence of Elizabeth, she has no way to source a stabilizer, which causes her body to disintegrate. However, her attempt fails, and what spawns into existence is a monstrous hybrid, Eliza Sue. The hybrid form goes to the live broadcast, where her mask falls off, causing fear and panic among the audience at her beastly form. As the creature begins to sprout forth abscesses in the forms of organs, a man decapitates her, which drenches the entire audience in the viscera and blood gushing forth. The pacing of the scene and the grotesque visual stand on equal footing is sure to leave an imprint on the audience's mind as a nightmarish reminder of how gruesome the implications of aesthetic norms are that are nothing but utterly corrosive. The monstrous Elizasu holds a mirror to our double standards and how fragile our bubbles of security are. The substance is a metaphor for our obsession with ludicrous standards of beauty that the entertainment industry mandates. Tetsuo, the Iron Man, 1989. Some films storm onto the scene regardless of the odds. Tetsuo is one such example, a cult classic in body horror and gore that remains true to its course. It was Shinya Tsukamoto's maiden film, funded by his savings from his day job. As a cyberpunk techno-horror, Tetsuo doesn't shy away from the excesses of violence typical of Japanese horror. However, its legacy surpasses any cinematic project before or after it. In the 80s, Japan underwent significant cultural upheaval, transitioning into an era of rapid industrial development and technological growth. This shift fostered a sense of withdrawal and apprehension about the future. Tetsuo ruminates on sensory overload and the distortions technology inflicts as we become increasingly invested in it, with heavy industrial music, metallic screeches, and a metallic infestation that begins as revenge but soon engulfs the town. Tetsuo is as vile as it is horrific. It rejects any aestheticization of the madness and decay often intertwined with erotic passions depicted in the film. Perhaps the artistic flair in the film is the liberty and the boldness of pursuit that the director commits himself to and delivers in the movie. Tetsuo can be likened to the works of David Lynch and Cronenberg, who, as Tsukamoto admittedly professed and never contested, are some of the most influential figures who certainly did inspire his work. Tetsuo is the story of a fetishist who once cuts open his thighs and thrusts a metal rod into it, which naturally causes his flesh to rot and is a breeding ground for maggots. Appalled and horrified at the sight, the fetishist cries out for help and runs into the street, which is when he gets hit by a car. Meanwhile, we see a salaryman being tormented by recurring visions of heavy industrial and metal machinery. While preparing to leave for work, he discovers a metallic spike protruding from his cheeks that squirts blood when he pokes it. The salaryman then calls his girlfriend, as he seems to have been worked up about some unknown incident, which we will learn about later. He was referring to the accident where he almost ran the fetishist over and attempted to dispose of his body to evade charges. In the meanwhile, the fetishist devises a plan to turn the salaryman into an Iron Man, which he does, and the two eventually merge into a gargantuan, phallic tower of metal, which then pledges to wreak havoc on the Earth by turning everything into metal. Bear in mind that the 80s was also an era where the AIDS and HIV epidemic was at its peak. The film's grotesque sexual encounters and inane phallic projections are often reflective of the homoerotic biases and prejudices that many attributed to the outbreak of the epidemic. Raw, 2016. The next film on our list is A Vegan's Worst Nightmare. Written and directed by Julia Ducournau, Raw is a coming-of-age body horror that gets under your skin, no pun intended there, and rattles you to a point where you lose sight of everything humane as you steep yourself into a cesspool of visceral mirth by celebrating yourself and your desires in all their hues. Raw takes a dig at how often societal conditioning limits our perception of what we are truly capable of and who we are by constantly injecting us with divisive adages of what's moral and immoral, which often misleads us into believing that we are inherently benevolent creatures created in the likeness of angelic virtues and ideals. Whereas, in truth, to quote the Joker from The Dark Knight, you see, madness, as you know, is like gravity. All it takes is a little push. And it couldn't be truer within the context of this film. So the film's core narrative centers around Justine, a vegetarian who enrolls at a veterinarian school where her older sister, Alexia, is studying and where her parents met. She meets her roommate, Adrian, and the two are pulled into a hazing ritual that every pupil undergoes as part of an initiation ritual. ritual. The following morning, Justine is forced to eat rabbit kidneys, which triggers rashes all over her body. The next day, she finds herself taken over by an uncontrollable urge to consume meat, which makes her feel ashamed. Justine eventually gives in to her desire to eat raw chicken and throws up. On the same night, Justine develops a taste for blood and human flesh when she starts chewing on her sister's finger and devours it. However, things steer out of control when Justine's newfound obsession begins to manifest while being intimate with a guy at another hazing ritual. She bites a part of his lips off. We see that her cannibalistic impulses set her off on a vampirish rampage when, in the most iconic scene of the film, she gnaws at her arm while having sex with Adrian. The film ends with her sister being taken away into prison for the murder of Adrian and Justine, who are sent back home after the horrific fiasco. We see her parents admitting to having undergone similar trials in their youth. Her father opens his shirt and reveals violent scarrings on his chest. Raw is a coming-of-age film at the end of it, and the theme of cannibalism is perhaps a metaphor for the scars that we carry with us from plunging ourselves into uncharted depths that often leave lifelong wounds of pain and suffering. The Fly, 1986. A Kafkaesque tale of horror and transformation, The Fly is a poignant cautionary tale about the obsession with technology and how nature stands supreme as a force that, if contested, will unleash unspeakable horrors. This is the film where David Cronenberg's genius as a filmmaker shines. It amplifies the scope of the story it's based on, which shares the same name. What's remarkable is how it transforms the narrative into something universal. It also serves as an allegory for the AIDS epidemic. Cronenberg never admitted to that device being a thought behind the film. Nonetheless, he appreciated the idea that the film could resonate with the perils of the time. The Fly became a benchmark for future directors like Steven Spielberg, Guillermo del Toro, and Danny Boyle. It blends sci-fi, transformation, and romance, culminating in bittersweet tales of tragic comedies. The Fly is as Cronenbergian as it gets. It has all the signature elements of Cronenberg, a horrific transformation into a non-human form, with romantic or erotic interludes of passion. However, what sets The Fly apart is the way the film serves as a space for the characters to rediscover themselves against the backdrop of science and technology and their limitations. So, coming to the plot, we have Seth Brundle, a maverick genius who is quite eccentric in the most stereotypical fashion you would expect. As it happens, Seth, played by Jeff Goldblum, chanced upon Ronnie, played by Gina Davis, a science journalist at a press event. The two hit it off instantly, and Seth takes her back to his warehouse home, which also happens to be his laboratory, to show her his telepods. Seth declares that this instrument is still a work in progress and is only capable of teleporting inanimate objects at the moment. He discovers this when he sees the baboon being reduced to a mass of scattered entrails. As Ronnie begins to document his work, Seth dissuades her. He convinces her to document his entire work once he finds success in teleporting humans. The two eventually become intimate and enter into a relationship. Seth eventually has a breakthrough and successfully teleports a baboon. In a leap of faith, Seth teleports himself. However, a fly gets inside the pod. Seth becomes increasingly fit after the teleportation, but starts losing his organs. His transformation escalates when, in an attempt to redeem his human attributes, he breaks into an abortion clinic and kidnaps Ronnie, who's pregnant with his child, to nullify the genetic alteration caused by the fly. Dathis comes in clutch, severing the wires by shooting at it, thus saving Ronnie. However, Seth, who is already reeling under an abominable transformation, becomes something more grotesque. He is then dispatched by Ronnie, as insisted by Seth, who retains a semblance of humanity in his final moments as he begs her to end his suffering. Excision, 2012. Very few films can reach the macabre depths that Excision does. There's no respite, no redemption, or repose for the audience. So yes, if you're easily offended, or if you have difficulty being offended, this film is not for you. Richard Bates Jr. delivers, and boy does he do that with finesse. Every film is crafted to perfection. Excision is one of those rare modern-day classics that, for good reasons, hasn't reached a mainstream audience. It tells a tale of hematomania woven into the fabric of a coming-of-age narrative. The story revolves around a deeply disturbed girl named Pauline, who's in high school. Excision is a lurid, dark comedy. It does not stop at anything to mock and deride the predominance of Christian rhetoric. It also critiques those who appear as authorities or flag bearers of such institutions. For instance, Pauline's mother loathes her, in contrast to her sister, who is held dear and upheld as the ideal daughter. The priest, too, is stunned by Pauline on multiple occasions with her crass humor. There are two layers to this plot. For the most part, the two merge or come together as a double entendre. They either shock or amuse the audience through the wry delivery of bizarre dialogues set against Pauline's erotic fantasies of mutilation and bloodbath. What's particularly interesting is that Pauline does not shy away from being her actual morbid self. She's openly vocal about her fantasies, often to the dismay and discomfort of her peers in class. However, she's also quite delusional. She dreams of becoming a surgeon and is convinced that sifting through a bunch of books at a library is all it takes. And so she does. She reads up on a bunch of books. In the film's final arc, she gives way to her deranged and ludicrous ambitions. She plans to cure her sister, who suffers from cystic fibrosis. She believes she can do this by swapping her lungs with those of the girl next door. She lures this girl into her backyard and knocks her unconscious. Then she shaves herself and proceeds to conduct the transplant by slitting their bodies. While the disaster unfolds, their mother returns home to her husband, who has been drugged and tied. Distraught, she rummages through the house and ends up in the basement, where she uncovers the horror before her eyes. Finally, hoping that her mother would be proud, Pauline believes the transplant was a success. She runs towards her mother. Her mother breaks down, wailing, and pulls Pauline into her arms. We see Pauline slowly breaking into tears, realizing what she's done. The performances are stellar. Anna Lynn McCord went all out to dive deep into the derangement of Pauline for the film. The dream sequences are nailed to absolute perfection. Every frame is a work of art par excellence. American Mary, 2012. It's a classic feminist revenge drama that neatly fits the body horror genre with flair and precision. Despite dealing with horrifying themes of rape and gore, the film never once falls out of place or becomes disorderly. The Soska sisters delivered their magnum opus with this banger of a flick. The film features Catherine Isabel, who plays the character of the film's central figure, Mary Mason. Mary is a medical student who, to pay her debts and finance her education, finds herself embroiled in some pretty shady business, to say the least. The movie opens with what looks like an incision being made across a human, later revealed to be a turkey, as the camera pulls back at a wider angle. Mary is beset on all fronts with no one to reach out to. Calls from the phone company indicate that she has difficulty managing her bills. She comes across an advert for a stripper at a club that she decides to take up to survive. Mary meets the strip club owner, Billy, who's the manager and owner of the strip club. Mary is offered to do surgery to save the life of someone who suffered a torture session that went too far. Mary returns home paranoid and traumatized, unable to process what she's just witnessed. At this point, she's contacted by a mysterious woman named Beatrice, who shows up at her door. Beatrice reveals that she has undergone severe body modifications to be the world's only living equivalent of Betty Boop. She offers her entry into the body modification, which she reluctantly accepts upon being offered 10 grand to do a procedure on a girl named Ruby. While Mary navigates and finds her way into the world to earn a life of dignity, everything falls apart when Dr. Walsh invites her to a party. She is drugged by Dr. Grant, who rapes her. This sets Mary off the edge, to the brink of chaos and insanity. We don't see Mary cowering down, but hatching a plan to kidnap Dr. Grant and perform heinous transformations on the doctor. In a bid for revenge, Mary uses this opportunity to advertise her experiments and puts up her work on Dr. Grant, building her website that attracts the attention of the demonic twins from Berlin. Nonetheless, all comes to naught as she is stabbed by the disgruntled husband of Ruby, whom Mary had earlier done a procedure on. Mary tries stitching up her wounds, but eventually dies in her studio. Unlike other body horrors, this does not drive on some underlying intricate neuropathology to begin with. American Mary is about the indelicate nature of society that bogs down and smothers innocence to endure perpetual trials until the victim decides to step up and give back precisely what the system dishes out, in a fashion that exudes and taps into our baser instincts, kicking into us the primal urge to assert who we truly are. The film drives on pure rage and the mad rush of adrenaline that will have you on the edge of your seat and set you off like a ticking bomb until your brain explodes. And the horrors are sure to linger for a while after the credits roll. The Skin I Live In, 2011. La piel que habito, or The Skin I Live In, is a thriller drama where much of the horror lies not in the excess of gore, mutilation, or grotesque transformations. As a matter of fact, for a body horror, this movie almost doesn't have any moments of shock, screams, or bone-chilling visuals that we would normally expect. Directed by Pedro Almodovar, the film stars Antonio Banderas in the role of a plastic surgeon, Robert Lagarde, and Elena Anaya in the dual roles of Vera and the deceased wife Gal. It's a tale of vendetta, bioethics, and gender identity, tying into the film's core narrative to raise serious questions about vigilance, status, class struggle, and the hunger for power. It's quite heavy and doesn't demand sensory participation as much as it urges reflection, an afterthought that encourages more dialogue on issues that are usually swept under the rug amidst the clamor of familiar and overused tropes of monstrous non-human others and extraterrestrial infestation or invasion. What we often lose sight of is the fact we are already quite deeply entrenched in the miseries and violence in the way that we function within social norms and regulations. Coming to our plot, we have a plastic surgeon who has a decisive breakthrough when he cultivates an artificial skin that is resistant to burns or insect bites. However, his trials were soon banned after it came to light that he had performed illegal transgenic experiments on humans. He then permanently retired to his estate, where he lives in the company of Marilia, the house servant, and Vera, whom he has held captive. One day, Marilia's estranged son Zika appears in a tiger costume at the doorstep. Upon inviting himself to evade the police for a robbery that he had been a part of, Zika discovers Vera and lusts after her by mistaking her for Gal. He eventually binds her mother as she resists him from what he has made up his mind for. Zika eventually rapes Vera, but is later shot by Edgard, who catches him in the act and shoots him dead. It's then that Marilia confesses Zika is his brother and that Robert is her surrogate child. We then come to realize, as the narrative paces back and forth into the past, that Robert's wife was burnt in an accident while eloping with Zika in the distant past. Her burns served as an inspiration to create artificial skin resistant to burn. However, he cannot save his wife as she dies by killing herself upon discovering her disfigured face. And as for Vera, formerly, Vicente was a man who met Norma, Robert's daughter, at a wedding, and as the two had become intimate, Norma tried pushing him away upon being triggered by a melody that she used to sing to cope with her mother's suicide. Vicente, fearing she might draw undue attention, smacks her unconscious and leaves on a motorcycle. Norma regains consciousness but is traumatized and believes it was her father who had come to save her. Lagarde then pursues Vicente, kidnaps him, and tortures him for days before performing a forced vaginoplasty on him and slowly morphing him into his deceased wife and giving him the identity of Vera. Vera could never fully come to terms with the reassignment and suffers a derailment, but never quite forgets her past. She eventually takes Robert into her confidence and shoots him and Marilia, who then utters the famous last words, "I knew it," as she always had her doubts about Vera. Vicente returns to his mother and quietly confesses that he is Vicente. But then he breaks down. The movie is a horror masterpiece, and the transformation takes place rather discreetly, on occasions fittingly, but no less horrific or gut-churning. True horror lies not in gore or vampirish bloodlust, both of which are, in reality, an aestheticized after-effect of the derailment that the mind ponders over and suffers. The Skin I Live encapsulates the true essence of horror that Vicente suffers when he's stripped of his gender, thereby his agency and identity upon forced reassignment of sex and vaginoplasty against his will. Can we think of anything more horrifying than to live in a skin that is not even your own? The film tackles this theme brilliantly. The somber atmosphere and deliberate slowness with which every frame unfurls really sets the tone for an ominous threat that permeates every frame. It's the perfect watch on an idle fall afternoon and is best enjoyed over hot beverages. Eraserhead, 1977. As always, we saved the best for last. A classic Kafkaesque existential horror, Eraserhead is a pioneering vision that was years ahead of its time. David Lynch's Eraserhead has inspired generations of directors worldwide and will continue to do so in the years to come. Lynch calls this film one of his more spiritual works. Eraserhead is a meditation on the anxieties of the past that cascades into the anxieties of the future, and the space in between is where the action in Eraserhead takes place. It's a ghoulish fever dream that offers a deeply visceral take on the plight of fatherhood, the onslaught of a new life, a child signifying a responsibility that, despite our best intentions, we find ourselves ill-equipped to handle. However, above all, it's an excellent example of body horror, which forms the core aesthetics of the film. It's meant to be surreal, and the film's monochrome aesthetic perfectly captures that ambition. After all, it's meant to be a realm quite similar to a dream, where every setting and backdrop acts as a continuous reminder of how counterintuitive and incoherent the pacing is. As for the plot, it's quite simple and rarely serves a clear purpose. Set in what looks to be a post-apocalyptic society, the narrative follows Henry Spencer, played by Jack Nance, who has a girlfriend named Mary. Mary moves in with him to live at his apartment after becoming pregnant with his child. She delivers a deformed mutant fetus, its skin wrinkled with a disproportionately large head compared to the rest of its body. Mary refuses to tend to her child anymore due to its bellowing screams that she can no longer bear. Mary leaves the child to the care of Henry, who's on vacation. Taking care of the child takes a heavy toll on him, driving him to the edge of his sanity. Essentially, this is the central narrative of the film. What's perhaps the most fascinating of scenes is Henry's vision in a nightmare as he watches his head pop out on the floor in a pool of blood to be replaced by his child's monstrous head. He watches his dismembered head being threshed into erasers and pencils. It's one of the most unsettling moments in the film, not because of the sheer horror of what happens, but because it symbolizes his anxieties as a father. Many interpret the erasers and pencils to be an attempt to undo or rewrite a past that he so desperately wants to escape, which he eventually finds in death, as he embraces the woman in the radiator to liberate himself. Marvelous verdict. Arthouse and body horror is a convention that goes as far back as the late 19th century. It began as an experimental endeavor in the hands of Georges Méliès when his The House of Horror, based on a gothic fantasy short story, was released in 1896. Since then, arthouse and body horror have come a long way, and its legacy was cemented in popular culture in the early 70s. It's a fascinating genre that offers a rich design that emulates the many horrors of the human mind that we each carry deep within our subconscious. For some, body horrors are a way to reclaim agency, to let loose in a space without fear or judgment, and as for others, they would delight in the sheer chaos. Both are unnecessary, as both are ways that offer an essential release to declutter our minds and raise important questions about our existence. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.